Hey guys, I'm Dr. Mike Strunc. I'm a pediatric neurologist and a narcolepsy doctor. I work in Southern Virginia here in Norfolk. And thank you guys for joining us today. I hope it's nice where you are. It's beautiful here in Southern Virginia. We're going to talk about narcolepsy and try to focus on teenagers, which is a lot of my population as far as a neurologist and a sleep doctor. But hopefully some of this stuff will be good for anybody who has narcolepsy or families of patients who have this disorder. Um, they did put up a slide about questions. So just to remind everybody, there's a way to go to the question and answer box. You can click in there and put any questions you have in for me or speakers that are going to be answering questions. I'm a bit of a fast talker, so hopefully I don't go too fast. And please type in if I am, and I'll try to slow down. But I'm happy to be here today with you guys. So as a pediatric neurologist and a sleep doctor, I see lots of kids with narcolepsy. So my patients run from early grade school kids up to college age and young adults for narcolepsy as a disorder. And the goal in about 20 minutes is to talk a little bit about narcolepsy as a disease. And then I'm going to tell you how I tend to help with my patients and their families to try to help narcolepsy not be this devastating disorder, but something that they have, but they sort of deal with and that they can be the awesome patients and people that they are. So narcolepsy is also challenged when schedules are crazy. And I would also just acknowledge for everybody out there that we're all dealing with this little thing called COVID-19 or the coronavirus. So it's quite a phenomenon. And as a result, for all of us, and particularly for a lot of my patients with narcolepsy, their lives were turned upside down. And when their lives and their days and their nights are turned upside down, it can be really quite a challenge because of narcolepsy and how a schedule that's erratic can really sort of wreck your day or your night. So that challenge in regard to school, summertime, jobs, and for the folks you're going to hear from later, high school and college students, those are big challenges. But again, hopefully, if we talk about narcolepsy and maybe some of the keys that my patients and I work on, there'll be something useful that you hear today. So narcolepsy with cataplexy is a disorder that is a neurologic disorder. It's permanent, so it doesn't go away. I always tell my patients it's a marathon, and sometimes it's a marathon because it seemed like it took forever to get to a diagnosis. I would say about 1 out of every 10 patients I have, one of their parents has it, and they usually don't know until they see me. And then when we talk about narcolepsy, they're like, I have all those things, and like, you have narcolepsy. So it's frustrating. However, as a marathon, meaning it's not going to be gone tomorrow, it sort of gives us a chance to work through the diagnosis and then work through all the things we can do to treat it so that, again, for my patients, they can be awesome and successful and happy. And I think we're successful most of the time with our patients. So narcolepsy is a disorder that's been around for millennia, but it's been recognized since about the late 1800s. There were two dudes. This one guy, Dr. Westphal, was a German neurologist, and there was a French doctor, Dr. Gelino, and they get credit for really defining this disorder. So Dr. Gelino had a guy that was a wine cask maker as his first patient, sort of a middle-aged guy. And his son's job was basically to stay with his dad so he wouldn't fall asleep or fall down and hurt himself every day going to work. So really severe narcolepsy. But he described cataplexy and the symptoms way back then. So we've known about it for a long time. But I'll tell you, really, this is a time that I don't want anybody to have to deal with narcolepsy. But honestly, if you have it right now, as you'll hear later on again, there are interesting developments in the treatment of narcolepsy that are moving pretty fast. And so I think that's going to be great for our patients in that it gives you sort of more things in your toolbox to use when it comes to treating this disorder. So narcolepsy is a neurologic disease or disorder. It is caused in patients who have narcolepsy with cataplexy by some immune phenomenon. I can't tell you why that always occurs, but an immune phenomenon that affects your hypothalamus, sort of a deep structure in the middle of your brain. And there's an area of the hypothalamus where there are these cells that make a chemical called hypocretin or orexin. And in narcolepsy with cataplexy, this area of your brain gets injured by this immune process, and you lose some or most or all of these neurons. And as a result, it causes all these symptoms. Now, that area of your hypothalamus, I always talk about as the circuit breaker of sleep, or sort of like the sleep switchboard. So what I mean is that in narcolepsy, this sleep switchboard or circuit breaker gets broken. And what it usually does, if you don't have narcolepsy, is it tells your brain to go to sleep, to dream, to wake up, and to stay in each of those places in the right order, in the right time, without you having to consciously think about it. So most people wake up and they're awake all day. And in America, we're all sort of sleep deprived. But if you're well rested, you don't have to consciously think like, stay awake, stay awake, stay awake. Now, all of us have been in that situation, but normally. But in narcolepsy, because this circuit breaker is sort of broken, your brain is wanting to flip from awake to sleep to dreaming sort of randomly. And so if your brain is not sort of busy or engaged, it can just slide into sleep for a second or a minute or half an hour. Sometimes you might not even know it. And it's because this is very unstable. I always tell my patients that narcolepsy is sort of like if you had 3 different colored ping pong balls. So, red, white, and blue in America. And one of those is for awake, one is for sleep, but not dreaming, and one is for dreaming sleep. And if I took the right number of ping pong balls and put them in a basket and mixed them up and dumped them out on the floor, I tell my narcolepsy patients, this is what your brain is doing every day, and all night in regards to your sleep. And that's why it's so sort of chaotic and frustrating. So when that happens, what happens as far as symptoms is sleepiness, and that sleepiness gets worse and worse and worse over time. It's interesting that a lot of patients, this diagnosis is quite delayed, which is frustrating. And patients, the people that they love and who care about them and their doctors often might misinterpret what that sleepiness is. And that's because really a lot of us are sleepy in America. So it seems like it's just a normal thing, not the pathologic sleepiness of narcolepsy. So the sleepiness is by far the biggest symptom for most people. However, in narcolepsy, when this whole circuit breaker sort of gets broken, the other symptoms of narcolepsy manifest as well, and they may spill in over time. And those things are the vivid, powerful, realistic dreams that people have, hallucinatory events that can occur before you fall asleep or randomly through your day, this thing called sleep paralysis, which everybody does not have, where you wake and your brain seems to think when you're waking, maybe you're entering a dream. When you're dreaming normally, we don't want you to get up and run around, so you should be paralyzed. So you wake up out of a dream or in the night or out of a nap, and you can't move and you can't talk. It can be quite terrifying. It is not dangerous, but it can be frightening. And then during the daytime, people have sleep that intrudes randomly through their day if they're not busy or engaged. And they might fall asleep and just immediately start having a dream. Or you might fall asleep in class working on a worksheet and you think you finished the worksheet and then someone says, turn it in, and you sit up and you go to turn the paper in and it's not filled out because you thought you did it, but you didn't. So I've had patients who got up in the morning, got dressed for school, and then their mom was waking them up because they were in bed and they were not dressed for school. So these odd phenomena. And then of course, cataplexy, which is this thing when you have intense emotion of feeling weakness. And that does not happen for all patients, but most folks over time, it shows up and it can be delayed for a long time. And cataplexy is also one of these things that lots of folks have, but don't know they have it because it can manifest in such varied and different ways. So for all these symptoms, it's always amazing to me and to my patients why their diagnosis for this took so long. Why did it take so long to figure this out? And part of it is what I just mentioned, which is, a lot of people are sleepy. So when sleepiness shows up, it's really thought to be normal, or it's just you. Or commonly in my patients, sleepiness is because I always tell them it's like moral failure. It's sort of like you didn't get to bed on time and you stayed up too late and you're on that TikTok and Snapchat and Facebook and you're up all night. And then you had to get up early because you had practice and then school and then you had work and you're also volunteering to tutor. So sometimes we're overscheduled. Sometimes we are sleep deprived. But in narcolepsy, many of my patients, they can sleep for 6 hours or 12 hours. It doesn't really matter because sleep doesn't really buy them a whole lot. So for narcolepsy, in patients that have narcolepsy for this disorder, when these manifestations show up, it takes a while sometimes to get diagnosed. We're not going to talk specifically about the testing we do, but talk to you a little bit about in narcolepsy, how do we approach this as a disorder to help people? So for my patients, when I see them, the first thing I tell them when we get to a diagnosis of narcolepsy is, you're not alone. This is 1 out of every couple thousand people. And it's also not a surprise that it took a while because of those things we just talked about. And one of the things that I see a lot in narcolepsy is that often tied to narcolepsy, and it might be accurate or it might be sort of blamed, is mood stuff. I mean, anxiety, depression, and all the mood things. And as a neurologist, when I see neurologic disorders, whether it's migraine or epilepsy or narcolepsy, mood disorders in general, written big, live with that a lot. So if that's part of what's going on and I ignore it, that's going to be getting in the way of us treating you successfully. So I have to pay attention to that. And also, I always tell my patients, there are metabolic effects when this hypocretin or orexin axis gets broken. Sometimes patients gain weight, sometimes significant weight. And it's not because they're up all night binge watching Netflix and eating pizza. They're being really responsible. They just gain weight because of the metabolic effects of this disorder. And that also can build on the symptoms and the mood effects that you have. So when we have patients with this, when I do for my families, first we have to talk about narcolepsy, explain it, make sure we know what that diagnosis is, what are your symptoms, and what do you want to get better. So sleepiness is the biggest thing, and the other manifestations are there. Sometimes those are really big for patients. So vivid dreams or episodes that are really disturbing can really be upsetting for patients as well. So when I see patients that have narcolepsy, we talk about what we're going to do. We sort of have an approach to how to treat this disorder for them. And the first is what I said about narcolepsy being, this is a long-term disease, meaning that it's a marathon when we're talking about treating the patients. When patients have narcolepsy and I'm trying to help them, that long-term course of the disease means that we have time to sort of get to treating it successfully. In treating narcolepsy, the first thing is education. So I always tell my patients that narcolepsy, the more you know about it, education is sort of power for you. So the Narcolepsy Network is a phenomenal resource for going to a place to learn about narcolepsy. And there are many other sites that we have and many materials that your doctor has or that I have that I share with my patients. In narcolepsy, when it comes to treating this disorder, the sleepiness is, of course, one of the biggest things. And when we're talking about treating narcolepsy, my first thing for my patients is we have to learn about narcolepsy. And then number two, we have to sort of make a plan for your schedule or your life and how it's going to work. And what I mean is that in narcolepsy, if your schedule's crazy, like for example now, it's going to affect you way more than, say, me or someone who doesn't have narcolepsy. So scheduling, how you schedule your day, your night, your sleep, your activities, whether you have college classes that are early in the day or late in the day, or we try to put them all late in the day, whether you schedule time for a nap, all of this organizing your day is really important. Now, most of my patients can't take their day and be structured perfectly every day, and I certainly don't expect them to. But they generally will agree that, for example, on my school days, say Sunday through Thursday, I'm going to have a schedule for sleep that I follow and I respect. Often we'll have this written out and sort of taped to the refrigerator or taped to their bedroom door. And it's a reminder that this is the schedule you're going to stick with during this part of the day or this part of the week. So if we do that for our patients, that schedule and that structure is really important for them. The second thing about that is then things that are tied to mood. So when you have mood issues, like we talked about, that might be mistaken as narcolepsy or blamed for it, or they live together for you, then I want to make sure we address that as well. It turns out that some of the treatments for narcolepsy, the medicines, are also medicines that we use to treat these other things. So if mood issues are a real piece of what we're dealing with, then sleep schedules, talking to someone that maybe is not your mom and dad, a counselor or something like that, can be really useful. And then another part of treating mood, but also treating narcolepsy itself, is exercise. We talked about the metabolic effects and how that can affect people. So for my patients, I also want them to try to build that into their day. And you do not need to be a triathlete. Some people just love to exercise. It's like part of their life all the time. And they make me mad because it's really hard for me to regularly get exercise. But planning that, for example, in the morning or after school, not before bed, I have some exercise that is scheduled, and it might be on that schedule that I taped to my refrigerator. Having a piece of that helps your body, helps your brain, helps all of these symptoms when it comes to narcolepsy, and that can be really helpful as well. The last thing about narcolepsy, when we've sort of addressed these other things, is the medicines, and medicines are a big part of treating narcolepsy. Medicines for narcolepsy come in sort of several big different categories, the way I categorize them. So first are stimulants. Stimulants are wake-promoting agents. A typical medicine for that would be Ritalin or methylphenidate, or dextroamphetamine. A form of that might be Adderall. And there's a medicine called modafinil. And these agents in our brains help wake them up. So some of those are ADHD treatments, but in narcolepsy, they sort of help your brain be more awake and alert. They don't really affect your brain's circuit breaker and what's going on when you're sleeping, but they are really part of what helps you wake up. So we use those frequently, and there are many, many ways to use them: once a day, multiple times a day, short acting, long acting. And sometimes one of them might be tough to use for you. It has side effects, but sort of the cousin or sister of that medicine, you do great. Beyond those medicines, there's a medicine called sodium oxybate or Xyrem. This is sort of a unique chemical. It's in its own box. And it's a medicine that sort of does affect that circuit breaker when you're sleeping. It's a really important medicine for narcolepsy. It's the only one that's actually approved to treat the sleepiness as well as the cataplexy. But it's a liquid, tastes sort of salty. You take it at nighttime, so it can be a challenge to use. But it is a chemical that makes that sleep solid. If you have insomnia as part of narcolepsy, which is very common for my patients, Xyrem is a drug that when you take it makes you sleep really hard at night. And when you wake, that sleep has been useful sleep. You wake up feeling rested, more awake, and more alert. And as I was mentioning, that drug Xyrem also treats cataplexy and these REM phenomena that we see in narcolepsy patients. So it's sort of a two birds with one stone, or hitting a bunch of symptoms with one medicine. And it's very common for my patients that they might use medicines in both these categories. Beyond that, there are a couple medicines that have been approved recently, and there's some that are coming down the pipeline as well. One of these is a medicine that targets histamine. It's a medicine called Wakix, which sort of helps wake your brain up, and also can affect some of these REM phenomena to a degree. So that's a medicine that you take during the day that is different than those stimulant medicines as a wake promoting agent and affects a different part of this circuitry. And then there's a medicine called Sunosi. And Sunosi is a medicine that is sort of also its unique box as far as the classification. There'll probably be more in these boxes coming down the line, but right now these agents are sort of unique. And Sunosi is a long-acting, once-a-day medicine that also helps wake your brain up. It can be very powerful and very safe. Beyond these medicines that we're talking about that are targeting either sleepiness or the other phenomenon in narcolepsy, I always talk about the medicines that are outside of this box that I'm talking about. Those are medicines that might treat mood, for example. So plenty of the medicines that I use that might target mood issues actually also target some of the symptoms in narcolepsy. So it's important when we're trying to address that part of narcolepsy that we're thinking about how that might be treated. Medicines and also the things we talk about that are not medicines. So for my patients, those are all the steps we put into place. And then I tell my patients, when it comes to those medicines, just about everything in that box you should be trying. And the reason is that when you're trying one medicine, like I said, you might try the cousin of that or the sister of that medicine, and it works so much better for you. And because narcolepsy is a marathon, I really want to take time with you to help you learn about it, fix your sleep, get your mood things sort of put in the right place as we treat you, hopefully, and then use medicines appropriately to help you be awesome, the awesome person that you should be. I'll tell you that for my patients and families, they amaze me every day, and I've learned more from them about medicine and about narcolepsy and treating it over the last years. And I'm really thankful for them for helping me be a better doctor, and I'm certain I have lots more to learn from them as we move forward. Anyway, those are sort of the big picture steps that I use for my patients. So understand narcolepsy, educate yourself. Let's talk about schedules written big for all of the things that you have to do. Let's address mood issues and be aware of the metabolic effects and whether we can make exercise something that you do. And then think about the medicines we use, and in each of those categories, let's try to use them appropriately, safely, but work our way through them so that we can make sure that you're successful moving forward. And I think that's about 20 minutes. And I tend to run long, so I'm going to stop here. And I want to thank you all for paying attention, and hopefully something there was useful for you. And then our next issue is going to be, I think, some questions. So we'll have at least a few minutes for questions, and then I'll be done. And I thank you guys again for paying attention today. So I'm going to look and see if I can find questions for us. Okay. So one says, what do we know about the causes of narcolepsy type 2? And it seems that people who have narcolepsy type 1 with cataplexy have the same sleepiness, the falling asleep issues, but with cataplexy added in. So I will tell you that narcolepsy, we know a lot about the chemicals in our brain that affect sleep, and this hypocretin orexin axis. Actually saying the cause of narcolepsy, exactly what it is, we're not quite there yet. We have a lot of answers around what I was talking about immune theories and how that affects our brain, and the ability to know that there's this chemical, orexin, hypocretin, that affects our brains in narcolepsy is really important. But I'll tell you, in narcolepsy type 1 versus type 2, there are still answers about really cause and etiology that we haven't figured out yet. So I don't think I can answer your question really well. We just don't have a perfect answer. We've learned a lot, and knowing this circuitry of our sleep and how it works, and knowing some of the chemicals or the proteins that are tied to it, has really opened the door to some of the treatment options we have. But I don't think I can answer really what causes narcolepsy specifically, apart from the relationship between these things that we're talking about. So I kind of failed you there, but that's the best I could say. And I'd say there are some of our colleagues and someone you're going to hear from today also that might be a smarter guy when it comes to actually the details of etiology and where we might be right today. The next question is, what kind of side effects do the medicines have? This is another really big question, but I'll tell you that what I would first say is that side effects are really variable for any patient. So when I mention stimulants or Xyrem, for example, we know common side effects, but not everybody gets those. And sometimes they're really annoying, or you don't get them at all. So stimulants, for example, tend to affect appetite predominantly and can affect mood. Your appetite might go down, you might be irritable, cranky, but you might try another one and have none of those side effects. And some of them are dose dependent, meaning bigger doses affect you more. So it's just one of the things we have to pay attention to. Xyrem or sodium oxybate can make you sort of nauseous and queasy, but honestly, most people, once they're on it, tolerate it great, and it's really effective. So that'd be a question to have probably with your narcolepsy doctor, because each of those medicines is going to have unique side effects, and they're going to be variable for every patient as you take them and try them. And that's why I sort of work through those with my patients to try to figure out what's best for you, because everybody's different. A third question here is, I'm confused. I have narcolepsy type 2. Is my issue achieving deep sleep or going and staying asleep in REM? So I'll tell you, narcolepsy broadly, the way I describe it is complete instability of sleep and wake. So when we talk about sleep, dream sleep, and awake, this circuitry of our brain normally has that in a very organized way. If I showed you a table, like a picture of an all-night sleep for human beings, for people who are well-rested and don't have other disorders, there's a very uniform way that we go through sleep and how we stay awake. But in narcolepsy, it's sort of like those ping pong balls in the basket. That organization is sort of thrown out the window. So it's not just achieving deep sleep or dream, it's really the organization and how your brain normally goes through these different stages of sleep. And that's what we see. The effects are all of those symptoms that you then have with that disorder. And someone else here is asking, medicines work for both anyway. That's absolutely true. So in general, the medicines that we use for narcolepsy, whether it's type 1 or type 2 narcolepsy, are all that same group of medicines. And if you have cataplexy, then obviously that might be something I'm going to target. If you don't have cataplexy, then we may not have to worry about that. But remember, cataplexy as sort of a REM phenomenon is like those other phenomenons, and those might be happening to you and be really awful dreams or hallucinations. So the medicines that we have for narcolepsy broadly can be used for any narcolepsy patient, not specifically type 1 or type 2. All right, and we have one other question here, and this is, what books do you recommend patients read? All the great works of literature. Get some Shakespeare in there. No. So books to read. So I'll tell you, there are a couple of really excellent books on sleep disorders in kids and adults, but they're not very many great unique books. The Narcolepsy Network has some great resources that they have, and there are some books that are broadly written about sleep. And there are a couple pediatric sleep texts. They're a little bit sciencey, but they have good information. I'll tell you that in general, apart from textbooks or a book at the library, at the bookstore, I have a lot of my patients going online to the Narcolepsy Network, to big sleep centers that are in the United States that have a lot of resources, to the National Institutes of Health or National Institutes of Neurologic Disorders and Stroke. Those are great resources and places to get information. Does narcolepsy affect learning? So we didn't really talk about ADHD and those symptoms specifically, but learning and paying attention, focusing is a huge effect of narcolepsy. So for patients whose brain is sort of sleep is sitting on their shoulder all the time, and if you're not busy or engaged, you might fall asleep. You might not know that you fell asleep. It's common that I see patients who are diagnosed with mood disorders, and I put ADHD sort of maybe in that big box of other disorders where it's often either misdiagnosed or thought to be that disorder. They can live together, or I might treat narcolepsy and what we thought was ADHD isn't really there anymore. One of the questions is, besides medicines, physical activity, schedules, what natural lifestyle changes do you recommend to help manage narcolepsy? So diet, supplements, etc. So I'll tell patients a healthy diet, but I have patients who have done an Atkins diet or an elimination diet or become vegan or vegetarian. Some of those diets are just healthy diets. There's not one that I'm aware of that is specifically targeted toward narcolepsy, but that might be an area that I could learn some more about. There aren't any supplements or vitamins, again, that are well-researched that target narcolepsy specifically, but having a healthy, nutritious diet, which might involve simply supplements with vitamins that are routine, I think those are all reasonable options. And if someone has a medicine they want to try or a supplement, I always tell my patients, well, just tell me, let's talk about it. As long as it's safe and reasonable, I'd go for it, but I don't have any specifically that are targeted for narcolepsy. Do non-cataplexy patients take Xyrem? All the time. So Xyrem, as a drug that I mentioned is in its own box, is really targeting really all the symptoms of narcolepsy. It's the only drug really approved for all of that. So I think it is a powerful medicine that treats all of our symptoms really well. It can be a challenge to use it, so it's really important that you are working hard with your doctor to understand how to use it, but it's remarkably effective in patients who are successful on it. And how do I best explain to my friends in a way that they don't think it's fake? I'll tell you, that is a great question that we can end on. And the reason is that it's really true that in narcolepsy, I have so many patients who have been thought to be not necessarily fakers, but that their sleep is just sort of that they're not being responsible, or they don't care about me, or they're sort of lazy. It's amazing how that comes up in this diagnosis, and it really affects patients. So that's one of the things in narcolepsy, when you realize this is a disorder. I don't want you to have narcolepsy, but in a way it's like, aha, I knew there was something going on here. So I would tell you that if your friends or family or say this is fake or not real, I would turn them on to some of the resources I have. I would get some of those and say, read about this and let's talk about it. Because again, education is power for us, for our families, and for those who don't understand what we're dealing with. I think it's 2:30 now. We probably have to stop. I'm gonna look and see. There are a couple questions, but I think probably we're going to have to stop because it's 2:30 and I think my time is done. But I hope these questions, we can answer them in the future, and I hope I have a chance to meet some of you guys again. I appreciate the time to speak with you and have you guys pay attention here. I hope that it was useful. And I'm going to say goodbye, but hope you guys all have a great summer, and take care. Thanks so much.